Fire Emblem 7 wasn't my first nor my favorite in this prolific series, but it was my first step when I originally tried it into trying out the older games, and the one that gave me an incurable fetish for thighs. Recently, I wanted to go back and give this game another shot for two reasons. One, I have this fantasy about playing and making videos on every single Fire Emblem game in the series, and I gotta start somewhere. And the other is I have this dark realization that a lot of my thoughts about this game might be overcast by the dark cloud of nostalgia. And it's been a shocking almost 10 years since I first played this game, but I'm happy to step back into this game and world as it's really shaped my understanding of the Fire Emblem games. And this time around, I found some aspects of this game held up exactly how I remembered it feeling when I was a wee elder teen with an emulator and my virginity. However, some other aspects like the supports and how you gain them and the main villain and his plot for destruction sent me into a spiraling abyss of madness in wiki pages, trying to piece the puzzle together. So if you're ready for that journey, please let us begin talking about Fire Emblem on the GBA, as I would love to hear your feedback on this game as well down below. Upon starting up the game as a seasoned Fire Emblem general, I was immediately tasked with figuring out how I wanted to start the game. Oh shit, I actually did it. And while I contemplated going straight to Eligood's story, I decided to evaluate Lyn much more closely this time. Oh, anyways, it's been far too long since I've gone through that tutorial, and that was a mistake. If you are a beginner and for some reason still watching this video, Lyn's mode is a pretty great tutorial for the series. It will shove everything you need to know down your throat, but if you've played any Fire Emblem game ever, get ready to choke. The other thing that it does shove down your throat is the series' first tactician isekai. Help, I'm trapped as a tactician in a world full of multi-haired, colored, hot anime characters that keep dying. When I first played this game after having played Awakening, I was honestly kind of confused by this tactician character. However, while looking back into some stuff about this game, I did find a translation from my old interview between the series producer Tohiro Nashiro and Kentaro Nishimura. And this is all fan translated, FYI, so it might not be absolutely perfect. And to paraphrase, they essentially say, though, that the older games felt strange and that you had to move your main hero character, and then it's not exactly clear if someone's telling them or if the main hero character is telling them to move or not. And adding a tactician character shifts the player's perspective to a bird's eye view, and that eliminates the potential confusion, which actually does make quite a bit of sense. Granted, though, it's pretty easy to forget about Mark in this game until Lyn decides to turn her head and speak directly through the screen into your soul. But in this same interview, they also mention the tactician was originally supposed to depart on some unknown place at the end of chapter 10, and Eligood would take over as normal, but Nintendo kind of liked that decision, so it sounds like they pushed for that. And I personally think this was better to just stick to the tactician here, because it would have almost been very jarring to just for the tactician to just peace out Girl Scar before it all gets juicy. I do think this is part of the reason this tutorial is the most helpful in the series in acclimating new players to the Fire Emblem and inducting them into the cult of the triangle, the holy triangle I live by. I'd kill for this triangle, and any other game that does not follow this triangle makes me want to slightly hurt myself with a spoon. Regardless, it is still a decent bite-sized story that introduces you to some of the most important units, like Florina, the undisputed goddess for the remainder of this playthrough, and most. There's plenty of lovable characters and interaction in this main game with all the witty banter between characters like Eligood, Hector, and Lyn, and it's definitely a strong point of this game, but I would be lying to you if I said that the character writing was what made me fall in love with these characters, and not just their appearance or ability to perform in combat. I can't be the only one obsessed with Fiora solely because of her hair color, am I? And subsequently disgusted with Heath and his bizarre tactic for using two-tone green hair to confuse the enemy. Also, how supports are raised is absolute Lagoosh shit in this game. I really hate how you either have to plan perfectly to raise your support levels or just dance around at 2x speed at the end of every single chapter. But anyways, here are my favorite characters. The other thing that these early hours do very well is acclimate you to the political climate of this world and some of the best visuals and art style on the Game Boy Advance. I love the way these Game Boy Advance games look, the vibrant color palette, the pixel art, it's all immaculate, and especially on original hardware, it is pure Game Boy Advance perfection. I'm also so partial to these animations where the game really appeals to my nostalgia for GBA. Sure, they're not as dynamic as the past and future games, but they're a joy to watch, and they have so much power and flair behind every single crit. These crits also hurt or satisfy even more when you decide to play the game as the developers intended and Iron Man the entire playthrough. God damn it, guy. Let's keep moving forward though, as after you've thwarted Lynn's shitty uncle's plan to dominate Caelid, we'll move on with Eligood's story, or Hector if you roll like that. I know the next few chapters are a new story intro, but it did slow the pacing down a little bit for me, and now that we're past the tutorial and played a few chapters, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the gameplay of this game. Here it's considered by many to be very basic and toned down in this game compared to the SNES games, which is true with the removal of things like leadership stars, but at the same time, I do think that's what makes this a great entry point for the series. This game seems to really live well by the mantra of easy to learn with something like Lynn's mode and hard to master with something like the Hector hard mode. I have played quite a few other tactics and strategy games, but I just always come back to Fire Emblem games like this for the fluidity of gameplay that makes you feel like an esports god when you're good. But anyways, back to the story. There's a lot of JRPG anime coincidences in the character intros in this early section while you're introduced to the Black Fang and Nurgle. And I did find some of this to be until you get to that first climactic moment where Eligood meets his dad again, only for it to be very short-lived. And it's in places like here that we get these computer-generated cutscenes along the way, and I do appreciate their inclusion, along with the tear-jerking music to drive home these important moments. And yeah, the music in this game is an absolute banger, although not my favorite in the series. This midpoint is also where I started to get more invested in the game. I love seeing a depressed and useless main character like Eligood climb his way back up, and I'm surprised at this point Eligood did not dye his hair black here on the wall. Along with a lot of just the other characters in general, and we get more cutscenes, like I said, more politics with characters like the 4 Fang generals are introduced, including characters like Jafar, who reminds me that I am just an absolute sucker for these edgy characters even in my late 20s. And now that the story is in full swing, we start getting the best chapters in the entire game from a story and gameplay perspective, at least in my opinion, and where the Iron Man run starts to really get quite nerve-wracking. At this one point in around chapter 24, I accidentally put Hector in Veda's sights, and pretty sure my heart stopped beating for a little bit, and ultimately it was my fault, but I don't like taking accountability for my actions, so fuck this map and fuck Veda. These midpoint chapters also really hammer home the theme of dealing with loss and family, with the different dynamics like those between Zephiel and his parents, Eligood losing his dad, and between everyone's favorite useless cinnamon roll, Nino and Sonia in a purple goop pit of frustration. This map is seared into my mind, the latter being a particularly gut-wrenching portrayal of child neglect and manipulation. And right after this, you also get chapters like the Cog of Destiny, another extremely memorable map, especially in Hector hard mode, as it starts off with like 43 enemies on just a regular normal mode playthrough, and they just keep coming, and it's really intense and long. But I really like this chapter. And finally, Eligood gets promoted after this, which makes him twice as useful. And we also meet characters like Bramimond, a very fairy tale mirror on the wall character / concept. Although he may not have been used to his full potential, but I really do like his inclusion in this story. But here is when I really get into the thing that really messes with my nostalgia / perception of this game. And that's when talking about Nurgle, the main villain of this game. In the past, I really liked Nurgle and a lot of the villains of this game. They have some pretty cool designs, but I know I was taking that all on a pretty surface level. On this repeat playthrough, I came out of these last few chapters just thinking, what? When I was first going through this, Nurgle's whole backstory is just he found a book one day and he was studying it and it turned him evil. And even though the end of this first playthrough, I kind of felt like I was missing something about his character. And frankly, I just kind of forgot things and I thought there was just more to his character. And after scouring the balls of wiki pages and playing a little bit more of the Hector hard mode, I kind of realized why that is. And that's because most of the real backstory for characters like Nurgle is relegated to Hector's story, but not even that. Hecton's Gaiden chapters, but not even that sometimes. I learned that there's this chapter called 19XX that I had never heard of.
Oh shit, here we go again.
This chapter includes important implications that Nurgle is actually the father of Ninian and Nils, which maybe it's my fault for not noticing that they have the same hairstylist and use the same dye, but for whatever hints that might have come throughout this game, I didn't catch on those. But personally, I feel like some of those hidden backstory moments for the main villain should not have been so subtle and locked behind these insane requirements, which you have to actually, in order to get this chapter, you have to play through Lynn's mode and raise up Nils' level and actually then do some back-to-back other chapter requirements to get to it. And it's just something I don't think I've ever done. And it's something I feel like very people are gonna find naturally. I know there's a lot of people that have probably known about this chapter for a long time, but I had no idea until recently. And I personally feel things like this should have been actually in the main story, or at least have some easier requirements to see them. And I think this could also be one factor why this game is quite divisive, since not everyone's gonna see this full context on their first playthrough. And this is probably the element of this game that had me really going in circles and confused and even questioning the game's greatness. And now I don't want you to think that that ruined the game for me. At worst, that brought it down from like a 9.5 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10 for me. But there's just no such thing as a bad Fire Emblem game in my opinion. Well, maybe. But I think in hindsight, this could have been handled a lot better. That being said, after a little battle prep chapter, which was kind of cute, the finale of this game awaits us, and while I do find it a little bit annoying, only certain weapons and units can do real damage to the final dragon and everything in this game, there's also a lot of little things, like the little smirk of peace that every morph gives you when they've been defeated. And these little things really add up into making this a fantastic set piece and finale for the game. Plus the epilogue had me really wanting to dive into a Binding Blade playthrough again. Overall, I'm really glad I gave this game another chance, mostly to fully engulf myself into the story and see how much nostalgia was covering up. Sometimes with a series like Fire Emblem, I get so immersed in the gameplay and the characters and how cool they are that the plot and some of the story elements kind of almost take a back seat to my incessant need to just go from chapter to chapter. Playing this again really made me think that there's other things I've missed in the other games, as I spent the years devouring every title back to back, with the actual plot and maybe some of the subtleties being little crumbs left in my brain. But someday I would love to piece that together for all the rest of the games. If you haven't played this game in a while, I definitely urge you to give it another chance and not just annihilate the red units and do challenge runs or whatever, but actually engross yourself into the story and its characters. And if nothing else, at least you'll get to enjoy some hot thigh action. Thanks for watching.